No one could explain how the tiny horse made it past the locked gate. Broken Horn Cattle Ranch sat miles from the nearest road, surrounded by fencing built to hold back 1,000-pound bulls, not wandering animals. And yet, just as the sun was lifting over the hills and the morning mist still clung to the dirt road, a shape moved where it absolutely shouldn't have. At first, it looked like a shadow. Then it stepped fully into the light, and every man on the ranch froze. It was a horse, but not the kind that belonged here. Barely reaching the chest of the nearest fence post, the tiny black and white horse stood alone in the open lane, mane tangled, ribs faintly visible beneath its coat. He looked wildly out of place, like a mistake the land itself had made. The big ranch horses along the fence lifted their heads one by one, ears pricked forward, eyes locked on the newcomer. 5 giants staring down at a single, fragile stranger. And the stranger didn't run. Instead, the tiny horse took one slow step forward, then another, as if he had chosen this place on purpose. From the barn doorway, ranch owner Caleb Warren narrowed his eyes. He'd spent 30 years on this land. He knew every sound, every shadow, every animal that belonged. This one didn't. His first thought was danger, not for the horse, but because a place like Broken Horn was unforgiving. Cattle spooked easily. Big horses could be territorial. One wrong move, and that little body could be trampled before noon. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans and started toward the fence, heart beating faster than he liked to admit. He'd seen abandoned animals before, too many, actually. Most didn't survive long out here. But something about this horse felt different. The way he stood tall despite his size. The way his dark eyes never dropped, even as the massive horses behind the fence snorted and shifted their weight. The tiny horse stopped just inches from the fence and lifted his nose, breathing in the scent of the ranch. Leather. Cattle. His ears flicked back and forth, taking in everything. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked straight at Caleb. That was the moment Caleb felt it, the strange pull in his chest he hadn't felt since the day he'd buried his old mare 5 winters ago. "Where did you come from, little guy?" he murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. The horse didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't bolt like a wild animal should. Instead, he stood there, steady as stone, as if he'd been waiting for someone to notice him. Behind the fence, one of the larger horses pinned its ears and stomped. Another snorted sharply. The tension snapped tight, like a rope pulled too far. Caleb raised a hand instinctively, calming the herd with a quiet sound. But his eyes never left the tiny horse. This ranch had rules. Unspoken ones. You didn't let strays linger. You didn't take risks with animals that could get hurt, or worse, cause chaos. Every instinct told Caleb to lead the little horse away, back toward the road, back to wherever he came from. But the horse took another step closer. Close enough now that Caleb could see the scars. Thin, pale lines crisscrossed the tiny horse's shoulders. Old rope burns healed badly. His hooves were chipped, uneven, telling a story of long travel without care. And yet there was strength in him too. A stubborn kind. The kind that refuses to lie down and disappear. Caleb swallowed hard. The ranch hands began to gather, drawn by the silence. One of them laughed softly. "Boss, that thing's no good for work." Another shook his head. Probably wandered off a petting zoo. The tiny horse flicked his ears at the sound of laughter but didn't retreat. He held his ground, eyes locked forward, chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Caleb felt a flash of irritation. Not at the men, but at himself. He'd spent years building this ranch after everything else in his life had fallen apart. The divorce. The empty house. The nights where the only sound was wind across the fields. Broken Horn wasn't just land. It was survival. And survival didn't have room for mistakes. Yet here one stood, breathing quietly in front of him. Caleb stepped closer. Too close, one of the hands muttered. If the horse spooked, he could bolt straight into the cattle lane. Disaster waiting to happen. But Caleb moved slowly, carefully, his body angled sideways, his gaze soft. He remembered how to do this. Horses remembered too. The tiny horse shifted his weight. Muscles tightened. For one heart-stopping second, it looked like he might flee. Instead, he lowered his head. not in submission. In trust. The ranch fell silent. Caleb reached out, stopping inches short of contact. The horse's mane lifted slightly in the breeze, brushing against his fingers. Alive. And in that instant, Caleb knew this wasn't just some stray that wandered in by mistake. This horse had come here for a reason. What Caleb didn't know, what no one on the ranch could have guessed, was that before the sun set that day, this tiny horse would change everything. The way the ranch worked, the way the herd behaved, and the way a hardened ranch owner looked at the idea of belonging. And as the fence creaked softly behind him and the big horses leaned in closer, watching, waiting, the tiniest horse on Broken Horn Ranch made a choice that would leave every single one of them speechless. Caleb should have sent the tiny horse away that morning. Every rule he lived by said so. Strays brought trouble. Trouble brought loss. And Broken Horn Ranch had already taken enough from him over the years. Yet somehow, hours passed, and the little horse was still there. By midday, the sun burned hot over the cattle lanes. The ranch hands returned to work, but their eyes kept drifting back toward the far paddock, where the tiny horse now stood under the shade of a weathered post. Caleb had opened the gate just enough to guide him inside, planning to keep him contained until he could figure out what to do. The horse hadn't resisted, hadn't panicked. He walked in as if he'd been there before. That alone made Caleb uneasy. Most horses, especially ones that had been mistreated, either shut down completely or exploded with fear. This one did neither. He watched. He listened. He learned. When a gust of wind rattled the fence, he startled, but instead of bolting, he planted his hooves and breathed through it. When cattle bellowed nearby, he lifted his head, alert but calm. "He's too quiet," one of the hands muttered. "That ain't normal." Caleb didn't respond, but the words echoed in his mind. Quiet horses often carried the loudest scars. He brought out a bucket of water and set it down a few steps away. The tiny horse eyed it, then looked back at Caleb. Not begging. Not desperate. Measuring him. After a long moment, he stepped forward and drank, never turning his back. That's when Caleb noticed something else. The horse kept positioning himself between the fence and the open lane, always aware of where the other animals were. When the larger ranch horses approached the fence, tossing their heads, the tiny horse shifted subtly, angling his body, signaling without sound. It wasn't dominance. It was awareness. "Boss," a young ranch hand named Eli said quietly, "that little guy's reading them." Caleb frowned. Reading who? All of them. As if on cue, one of the bigger horses, a chestnut gelding known for his temper, lunged suddenly at the fence, teeth bared. The tiny horse flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, he stamped once. Chirp. The sound cut through the air like a whip crack. The chestnut froze. Then, unbelievably, he stepped back. The ranch went still. Caleb felt a chill creep up his spine. That wasn't luck. That was instinct honed by experience a horse that size shouldn't have. That afternoon, clouds rolled in fast. Storm clouds. The kind that turned cattle restless and unpredictable. Caleb ordered the herd moved early, wanting them settled before the weather broke. As gates swung open and cattle began to move, the tiny horse grew tense for the first time. His ears flattened. His head lifted high. His body trembled. Something about the sound of hooves on packed dirt triggered him. Caleb saw it then, the fear he'd been waiting for. The tiny horse spun, eyes wide, breath rapid. For a split second, Caleb feared he'd bolt straight into the moving cattle. Disaster hovered, seconds away. Caleb stepped forward, hands out, voice low. "Easy, easy, boy." The horse backed away, muscles coiled, panic building. The wind howled. Thunder cracked in the distance. The world grew loud, chaotic. Then something happened that no one could explain. One of the younger calves broke from the group, spooked by the thunder. It stumbled toward the open lane, toward a steep drop beyond the fence. Shouts erupted. A calf that young wouldn't survive a fall like that. Before Caleb could react, the tiny horse moved. He lunged, not in fear but in purpose. His small body shot forward, cutting across the lane, positioning himself between the calf and the edge. He lowered his head and drove the calf back with sharp, precise movements, guiding, not chasing. The calf hesitated, turned, rejoined the herd. Silence followed. Rain began to fall. Caleb stood frozen, heart pounding so hard it hurt. He'd seen trained horses fail at moments like that. Big, strong horses with years of work behind them. This tiny, unwanted animal had acted without hesitation, without command. "He just worked that calf," Eli whispered. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he lowered them. The tiny horse stood where he'd stopped, sides heaving, rain darkening his coat. Slowly, he turned and looked at Caleb again. This time, his eyes weren't guarded. They were asking. That night, the storm passed, leaving the ranch quiet and soaked. Caleb sat on the fence rail long after the hands had gone inside. The tiny horse stood nearby, head lowered, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Caleb thought about the scars again. The rope burns. The discipline. Someone had taught this horse to work, and then discarded him when he didn't fit the mold. Too small. Too different. Too inconvenient. Just like Caleb had been told once, long ago, when his life had fallen apart. He stood, walked slowly to the horse, and for the first time, rested a hand fully against his neck. The horse stiffened, then relaxed. Leaned in just a fraction. Caleb exhaled shakily. "Looks like you wandered into the wrong ranch," he said softly. "Or maybe, the right one." What Caleb didn't realize was that the hardest test hadn't happened yet. Because by morning, the ranch would face a crisis no amount of strength could fix. And the only one who might be able to save it was the tiniest horse no one wanted. The crisis came just before dawn. Caleb was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, when the phone rang. On a ranch, early calls never meant good news. He answered on the second ring, listening as Eli's voice came through tight and rushed. "Boss, we've got a problem. Big one." Caleb was on his feet before the call ended. By the time he reached the lower pasture, the sky was barely gray. Fog hung low over the ground, thick and blinding. Cattle milled in tight circles near the creek bed, their low bellows vibrating through the mist. Something had spooked them badly. Then Caleb saw it. The old wooden bridge near the south fence, the one they rarely used, had partially collapsed in the night storm. One of the heavier cows had gone through, snapping beams and leaving a jagged gap over fast-moving water. Now the herd was trapped on unstable ground, packed too close, panic building with every step. One wrong surge and they'd stampede. And stampedes didn't stop for fences or people. Caleb barked orders, hands waving as ranch hands spread out to control the herd. Horses were saddled fast. The big working horses moved in, but the fog made everything harder. Visibility was near zero. Sounds echoed strangely. The cattle pushed and pressed, fear feeding fear. And standing at the edge of it all, unnoticed at first, was the tiny horse. Caleb's heart lurched. "Get him out of here," someone shouted. But it was already too late. A thunderous crack echoed as another beam gave way. A cow slipped, bellowing in terror. The herd surged toward the sound. Chaos exploded. Caleb swung into his saddle, adrenaline flooding his veins. He shouted, whistled, did everything he could, but the cattle weren't listening anymore. They were blind with panic. Then he saw the tiny horse break from the fence line. "No!" Caleb yelled, reaching out uselessly. The little horse darted straight toward the front edge of the herd, moving faster than Caleb had ever seen him move. His small frame slipped between bodies, hooves precise, movements sharp. A horn grazed his flank. Mud splashed up his legs. He could have been crushed in seconds. But he didn't slow. Instead, he did something that stunned everyone watching. He turned sideways to the herd and reared, not high, not wild, but controlled. His hooves struck the ground with a crack loud enough to cut through the noise. He squealed sharply, a sound full of authority that didn't match his size. The front line of cattle hesitated. Just long enough. Caleb seized the moment, driving his horse forward, pushing the herd to arc away from the bridge. Other riders followed, closing the gap. Slowly, painfully, the massive animals began to turn. The tiny horse stayed there, holding the line. Holding it alone. Then a cow broke through. She barreled toward the creek, slipping dangerously close to the broken edge. Without thinking, the tiny horse lunged forward again, driving her back, but the ground gave way beneath him. Time slowed. Caleb watched in horror as the tiny horse's front hooves slipped, his body pitching toward the rushing water. One more inch and he'd be gone, swept under, crushed by debris. "No!" Caleb screamed. The horse scrambled, muscles straining, hooves clawing at mud. For a terrifying second, it looked like he wouldn't make it. Then he screamed. Not in fear, but in pain. Caleb's stomach dropped. Ranch hands rushed forward as the cattle finally cleared. When the dust and fog settled, the tiny horse lay on his side near the bank, breathing hard, one foreleg twisted beneath him. Silence fell heavy. Caleb slid from his saddle and ran. Up close, the damage was worse than he feared. The horse trembled violently, eyes wide, sweat darkening his coat despite the cold morning air. His leg broken. No doubt about it. Eli swallowed hard. "Boss, he's done." Those words hit Caleb like a punch. Out here, injuries like that ended one way, especially for a horse that small. No insurance. No breeding value. No practical reason to fight for him. Caleb knelt beside the tiny horse, pressing his forehead gently against the trembling neck. The horse flinched at the contact, then stilled. His breathing slowed just a fraction. And that's when Caleb saw it. As he brushed mud from the horse's shoulder, something fell loose, something tucked beneath the matted mane. A strip of old, weathered leather. Faded writing burned into the surface. Caleb's hands shook as he lifted it. It was a training tag. And beneath the dirt and rain damage, a name was barely visible. Atlas. Caleb's chest tightened. Atlas. The one who carries the weight of the world. Suddenly, everything made sense. This horse hadn't wandered here by mistake. He'd been trained to step into chaos. To take pressure. To protect others no matter the cost. Someone had built him for responsibility far bigger than his body, and then abandoned him when his size didn't match their expectations. Just like Caleb's father had done to him. Caleb felt tears burn his eyes as Atlas shifted weakly, his nose nudging Caleb's sleeve as if to say, "I did my job." Caleb clenched his jaw. "No," he whispered fiercely. "You're not done." The ranch hands exchanged looks. They knew what he was saying. And they knew what it would cost. Veterinary care like this was expensive. Risky. No guarantees. And Broken Horn Ranch was barely staying afloat as it was. Caleb stood slowly, eyes never leaving Atlas. "We're saving him," he said. Not asking. Deciding. What Caleb didn't know, what no one could yet see, was that Atlas's greatest act of courage hadn't even happened yet. Because sometimes, the smallest horse doesn't just save a ranch. He saves the people who call it home. The vet arrived just after sunrise, her truck cutting through the lingering fog like a lifeline. Atlas lay where they'd moved him, wrapped in blankets, his small body unnaturally still. Every shallow breath felt too fragile, like it might be his last. Caleb stood nearby, arms crossed tightly over his chest, jaw clenched. He hadn't slept. Couldn't. Every time Atlas shifted or sighed, Caleb's heart jumped. He'd lost horses before, good ones, but this felt different. This felt personal. The vet knelt beside Atlas, careful, efficient, her face unreadable as she examined the leg. The ranch hands hovered at a distance, quiet now. No jokes. No skepticism. Everyone had seen what Atlas did. "It's a clean break," the vet finally said. "But it's bad." Caleb swallowed. "Bad how?" "Small horses don't always recover well from this kind of injury. The weight distribution, the stress, even with surgery, it's a long road. 6 months of rehab. And without surgery?" The vet met his eyes. "He won't make it." The words settled heavy in the air. Caleb looked down at Atlas, who blinked slowly, ears flicking weakly toward the sound of his voice. Still listening. Still here. "Do it," Caleb said. "Whatever it takes." The vet hesitated only a moment, then nodded. The days that followed blurred together into a cycle of care and exhaustion. Atlas was moved into the small recovery stall near the house, the one Caleb hadn't used since his old mare passed. Pain meds. Ice packs. Gentle hands. Long nights. At first, Atlas fought it. He pinned his ears when hands came too close, flinched at touch, refused food. Pain and memory tangled together until every movement felt like a threat. More than once, Caleb found him standing on 3 legs, stubbornly refusing to lie down, sweat darkening his coat. "You don't have to be brave anymore," Caleb whispered one night, resting his forehead against the stall door. "I've got you." It took time for the words to reach him. Caleb started spending hours in the stall, not doing anything. Just sitting, breathing, letting Atlas learn his presence without pressure. Talked about the ranch, about the weather, about nothing. About everything. About the day his father told him he'd never be enough to take over the family land. About the marriage that couldn't survive the long hours and quiet nights. Atlas listened. One evening, after weeks of tension, Atlas finally lowered himself to the ground while Caleb was there. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't easy. But he did it. Caleb turned away quickly, wiping his eyes. Healing came in inches, not miles. Some mornings Atlas wouldn't put weight on the leg at all. Some nights, pain broke through the medication, and he'd tremble, eyes wild. Those were the nights Caleb stayed the longest, hand resting gently against Atlas's neck, grounding him. "You held the line for everyone else," Caleb murmured once. "Let me hold it now." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Atlas began to trust. He accepted food from Caleb's hand, leaned into touch, rested his head against Caleb's shoulder when the pain flared. The scars on his body told stories of hard training, sharp commands, no room for weakness. But here there was space to be small. Word spread beyond the ranch. Neighbors stopped by. Kids asked about the tiny hero horse. Someone shared a photo online. Atlas standing in the fog, defiant despite his size. Messages poured in. Strangers offering encouragement. Donations. Stories of their own underdogs. Caleb hadn't asked for any of it. But for the first time in years, Broken Horn Ranch didn't feel so broken. Months passed. The cast came off. The leg held. Not perfect, but strong enough. The first time Atlas stepped outside again, the entire ranch seemed to hold its breath. He moved carefully, testing the ground. One step, then another. His ears flicked forward, eyes bright. Caleb walked beside him, close enough to catch him if he fell. Atlas didn't. Instead, he lifted his head and breathed in the open air like it was a promise. Later that day, something unexpected happened. The cattle grew restless in the far pasture, agitation rippling through the herd. Caleb was still inside, distracted, when a shout went up. Before anyone could react, Atlas, still unbridled, still technically in recovery, moved toward the fence. Caleb rushed out, heart in his throat. Atlas didn't run, didn't charge. He stood, positioned himself exactly where the herd needed him to be. Steady, present. The cattle settled. Caleb froze. Atlas looked back at him, ears forward, eyes clear. Not asking this time. Telling Caleb that he wasn't just healed. He was home. Caleb laughed, a sound that surprised him with its rawness. He wiped at his face and shook his head. "You unbelievable little horse," he whispered. What Caleb didn't know yet was that Atlas's final act, the one that would truly leave him speechless, was still ahead. Because sometimes, healing isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. The day the buyers arrived, Caleb didn't expect Atlas to change his life again. It was a clear morning, sunlight spilling across Broken Horn Ranch, the land looking stronger than it had in years. A regional livestock inspector had spread the word about the tiny horse that saved a herd, and curiosity brought visitors, some genuine, some calculating. Among them was a well-dressed man with polished boots and a practiced smile. He watched Atlas quietly from the fence. "That horse," the man said finally, "he's special." Caleb didn't answer. "I train performance horses," the man continued. "Small, agile ones like him? Rare. With the right program, he could be worth a lot." Atlas stood nearby, calm but alert, ears flicking back toward the stranger's voice. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. The man named a number, one that could erase debts, repair fences, secure the ranch for years. It was the kind of offer Caleb once would have prayed for. He looked at Atlas. At the scars that had healed into strength. At the leg that still bore the memory of pain, but also proof of survival. Atlas shifted closer to Caleb, shoulder brushing his thigh, not accidentally. Caleb smiled softly. "He's not for sale," he said. The man scoffed. "Everything's for sale." Caleb shook his head. "Not this." The buyer left, baffled. Later that afternoon, the ranch hosted a small open day. Neighbors, families, kids with wide eyes. Atlas moved slowly through them, gentle, patient. Children laughed as he nudged their pockets for treats. Adults grew quiet when they learned his story. One little girl reached up and hugged his neck. "He's brave," she said. Caleb swallowed hard. "Yeah," he replied. "He is." As the sun dipped low, Caleb led Atlas to the far pasture, the same place he'd first appeared, alone and unwanted. The big ranch horses approached the fence, ears forward, bodies relaxed. Atlas stepped closer. This time, there was no tension. The chestnut gelding, the one who once challenged him, lowered his head. Atlas mirrored the motion. No dominance. No fear. Acceptance. Caleb exhaled slowly. That night, as the ranch settled into quiet, Caleb sat on the fence rail again, Atlas grazing nearby. The wind carried familiar sounds. Crickets, distant cattle, the soft thud of hooves on earth. Caleb thought about all the times he'd almost given up. All the times he'd been told he didn't belong. That he wasn't enough. Atlas lifted his head and walked over, resting it gently against Caleb's chest. Caleb laughed quietly, emotion catching in his throat. "You know," he said softly, "you weren't the mistake." Atlas breathed out, warm and steady. "You were the answer." The camera pulls back. The tiny horse and the man stand together beneath a wide sky, no longer broken, no longer alone. And if this story moved you, if Atlas reminded you that strength doesn't always look the way we expect, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more true-style horse stories that celebrate courage, resilience, and heart. Because sometimes, the smallest horse carries the biggest soul.